Good morning. I'm Dagen McDowell in for Maria Bartiromo. It's Monday, June 4th. Your top stories at 8 a.m. Eastern. Markets extending gains from Friday, a 128-point gain on the Dow futures. Trade worries not showing up in the market. Stocks rallied on Friday following that much better than expected jobs report. The unemployment rate falling again at an 18-year low. We had a 219-point gain on the blue chips. And that green is now showing up in Europe. We have gains across the board to report to start this week in Europe. Same story in Asia overnight. All four major markets there gaining this Monday. Facebook under fire. A new report from the New York Times says the social media giant gave users data to device makers, including Apple and Samsung. This raising new privacy concerns surrounding the company. It's weighing on the stock, down nearly 1.5% in pre-market trading. This comes as the tech industry is facing scrutiny over censorship. Not just Facebook. House Intelligence Committee Chairman Devin Nunes had a warning for big tech on Sunday morning futures with Maria yesterday.
I would hope that they just don't get involved in politics and don't censor conservatives and Republicans. But if they continue to do it, then we have to move, obviously, to hearings on these issues.
We take a closer look straight ahead. Trade turmoil. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross returns from China with no deal. And it comes as our allies ramp up their threats of retaliation over our steel and aluminum tariffs. And breaking news overnight, a shooting on a football field. 5 people shot, including a pregnant woman who had to have an emergency C-section. We have the latest from Texas. Plus, scare in the sky. A flight forced to make an emergency landing after the plane's windshield cracked. And a warning from American Airlines. Ticket prices could go higher as that airline faces higher fuel costs. And former President Bill Clinton offering his take on the impeachment debate. He says proceedings would be in full swing for impeachment if a Democrat was in office. All of that and so much more coming up this morning. Fox News contributor Katherine Timpf is here, Benchmark managing partner Kevin Kelly, and Maslansky & Partners president Lee Carter. Good morning. We've got 1 hour left. I can't wait to get to all of that. President Clinton not helping the Democrats. No.
Of course not. Can I just say something about the market? So one of the reasons why we're seeing strong market action this morning, and we saw it actually strengthen into Friday's session, is because the manufacturing numbers exceeded expectations. I mean, we're well into expansion numbers. I mean, we were supposed to get a 57 print on the PMI numbers of manufacturing. We got a 58 number.
Except.
Yeah.
If you look at the front page of the Journal this morning, that global economic growth, that the optimism is dimming, that you have global manufacturing at a 9-month low, and the Baltic Dry Index, that shipping measure, peaked last month. Copper prices are falling, so they're warning flares.
Yeah, there's some warning flares on the global side, especially because that's emanating out of Europe, and so Europe is really weighing down the global economy, and so there's strife with political discourse. But the problem that you're having is not here in the U.S. We're 25% of the world's GDP. We're still strengthening, and so I think that's a good thing.
And let's move on to that Facebook privacy story. Its privacy policy under scrutiny again amid a new report. This is from the New York Times, that Facebook gave phone makers, device makers like Apple and Samsung, vast access to user data. Blake Burman is on this story in Washington, D.C. with more. Good morning, Blake.
Hi there, Dagen. Good morning to you as well. Yes, you're talking about the biggest names here: Apple, BlackBerry, Samsung, Microsoft, Amazon, just a handful of the roughly 60 device makers that Facebook shared data with, according to a brand new report out this morning from the New York Times. The partnerships, according to the report, allowed for the use of like buttons and address books, and allowed for Facebook to access the data of users' friends without their explicit consent. In a posting in response to the Times article, Facebook defending itself by saying, quote, "These partners signed agreements that prevented people's Facebook information from being used for any other purpose than to recreate Facebook-like experiences. Partners could not integrate the user's Facebook features without their devices, or with their devices rather, without the user's permission." Now, over the weekend, Congressman Devin Nunes was warning tech companies both of reaching into the political arena and whether or not companies need to be regulated.
That brings in a whole other set of circumstances. Are these companies, Facebook, Twitter, Google, Apple, et cetera, are they monopolies? And should they be reined in? I would hope we don't have to go there.
Now, this opens the door to even more questions about Facebook, Dagen, and user privacy. When Mark Zuckerberg was testifying on Capitol Hill just a few weeks ago, this issue was not publicly known then, so it was not raised either. Dagen?
Blake, thank you for that. Blake Burman in Washington for us. Turning to trade tensions, the Trump administration showing no signs of backing down after imposing sweeping tariffs on aluminum and steel imports from Canada, Mexico, and the European Union late last week, despite swift pushback from America's allies.
The national security issue is not about Canada or China or Turkey or any other country that sends us aluminum or steel. The national security issue is a flood of imports from 20 countries that are putting our aluminum and steel businesses out of business. And so the national security issue is basically us looking outward, defending ourselves against that flood of imports so that these industries can thrive.
Joining us now is President and CEO of Magna Gas, which is focused on the $5 billion metal cutting market, Ermanno Santilli. Ermanno, some of America's closest allies are calling these tariffs insulting, unacceptable, even illegal. They're threatening retaliation, lining up tariffs on goods that we export to nations like Canada and Mexico and Europe. How are these tariffs going to impact your business?
Well, Magna Gas Corporation is a profile of companies that will definitely benefit from these tariffs. Our ticker symbol is MNGA. We're a small to medium-sized company. We're in the industrial gas sector, and we've created an industrial gas that is unique, developed here in the United States. It replaces acetylene, and that's used to cut and form metal. So clearly, if this economy, in respect to the metal and aluminum, starts taking off, even more so than it already has, I think Magna Gas will definitely benefit, and we're not alone.
Ermanno, I apologize. How do you face shareholders and talk about the growth going forward and the volatility around these sanctions and your cash flows and managing really shareholder expectations? Because this may be a temporal situation that only happens for a few quarters.
Well, that's a good question. And at the end of the day, our customers of our product are not going to stop welding. They're not going to stop building. They're not going to stop producing automobiles just because the cost of welding wire goes up by 10%. I think it's something that and if you look at the industry as a whole, I mean, unemployment's down 18-year low. Back orders at a 14-year high. Industry really isn't that afraid about these tariffs on a whole, in my opinion.
The industry is not necessarily concerned, but a lot of the individuals out there are, because we just heard in one of Dagen's last interviews that there is going to be short-term pain for consumers. So while it might have an impact on jobs, do you think it's going to have an impact on individuals?
I think it's hype. If you look at a six-pack is going to go up by a few pennies. An automobile will go up by, the price will go up by $40. I honestly don't think it's going to have a huge impact on other consumers, frankly, and I think it's all hype.
But it's not just a six-pack of beer, and it's an automobile, Ermanno. It's everything that follows. It's also the retaliatory tariffs from all these other nations. The administration is looking at automobile tariffs. So if you want to buy a Kia, that Kia might go up by several $1,000s in cost. So the sum total, and it's not again, so you're admitting that consumer prices are going to go up. I mean, Peter Navarro was on this show when these tariffs were first announced, before they were ever implemented, saying, don't you worry your head, the six-pack of beer is not going to go up that much. But again, it affects the entire supply chain as well, and some manufacturers are left wondering how they're going to source their materials.
Yes, I think that's true. I think that there is a risk for some retaliatory tariffs. But tariff mechanisms are used every day by every country in the world. 50% of products imported into the United States are subject to some sort of a tariff. Now, it's not 25%. It's usually much lower. I think the average is about 2.5%. Retaliatory tariffs are a concern, but hopefully Trump will be using this as sort of a negotiation tool to avoid that.
Do you have any sense, have you talked to anybody in the administration at all, do you have a sense of when we might have more certainty on that?
No, I have not. I know that my customers and our suppliers, they're just kind of rolling with it. Prices are going up for aluminum and steel, but again, in our sector, we're not going to stop building just because something goes up by a few pennies.
Ermanno, thank you for being here. Ermanno Santilli, take care.
Our pleasure.
Coming up, President Bill Clinton ramping up his rhetoric, the former president arguing that impeachment hearings would have already started if a Democrat was the commander-in-chief. That's ahead. Plus a crude awakening, American Airlines warning customers might face higher ticket prices if oil prices stay high. We break down the details next. At least 5 people, including a pregnant woman, shot at a football game in Texas last night. Cheryl Casone has the details. Cheryl.
Right. Well, the pregnant woman was shot in the chest and underwent an emergency C-section. The baby reportedly is okay, but the woman herself is in critical condition this morning. Now, this happened after 2 people opened fire at a football game. It happened in South Dallas. This injured at least 3 women and 2 men. The motive for the shooting still unclear at this point. Police are searching for the suspects in this. One other headline we're following this morning, Jordan's Prime Minister, Hani al-Malki, has resigned after several days of protests in that country. Al Jazeera is reporting that Jordan's King Abdullah asked the Prime Minister to step down. These recent demonstrations over tax increases are the biggest in years in that country, and a lot of police fire and tear gas and blocked roads is now the result of these protests that have really erupted in Jordan, as you can see on your screen. Well, an American Airlines flight was forced to make an emergency landing after its windshield was shattered by a powerful hailstorm. One passenger able to get this picture. It shows, you can see here, the extensive damage to the nose of the plane. Luckily, the flight was able to land safely. No injuries were reported. But meanwhile, American Airlines is warning now that a continued rise in oil prices could result in higher ticket prices for passengers this summer. The spike in prices also resulting in a somber forecast for global airline profits in general. According to the International Air Transport Association, the industry is expected to post a $33.8 billion profit this year, but that's down 12% from the previous forecast. This, of course, due largely to rising fuel costs for the airlines. In May, oil reached $70 per barrel. For the first time in 4 years. Now we're at $65.52. But again, these higher prices, if they continue through the summer in particular, airlines can only hedge so much. Dagen, you know, they can maybe hedge 60%, 70%, but not the whole enchilada. So your ticket may get a little pricier this summer.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Yeah, all the good news for you this morning.
Thank you, Cheryl Casone. Coming up, President Bill Clinton speaking out, while the former president is arguing that impeachment hearings would have already started if a Democrat was commander-in-chief. Plus, tensions bubble over trade ahead of President Trump attending the G7 meeting in Canada. We're breaking down the tariff tussle ahead. A different kind of double standard. Former President Bill Clinton claiming if a Democrat was in office, impeachment proceedings would have already been happening.
I think they have tried, by and large, to cover this investigation based on the facts. I think if the roles were reversed, now this is me just talking about it based on my experience. If there were a Democratic president and these facts were present, most people I know in Washington believe impeachment hearings would have begun already. The
president teaming up with author James Patterson, you saw him there for a spy thriller, a fictitious spy thriller involving the President of the United States. Joining me now is Bree Payton, a staff writer for The Federalist. Bree, what do you make of Clinton's comments?
Yeah, I think he's totally wrong. I think that if the roles were reversed and if the Republican really were a Democrat, I don't even think that there would be an investigation at all, to be, quite frank. And you know what? The part of his comments that bothered me the most was at the end when he said that, the media has been covering this fairly and that their coverage of the ongoing Mueller probe has been, based in fact and all of these sort of things like that. I think that that's totally off base. I think it's clear that a lot of members of the media are active participants in this ongoing investigation. They're not passive recorders of history like Bill Clinton seems to think that they are.
Bree, hi, it's Kat. Why is Bill Clinton talking? I mean, do you really think that having him out there is something that helps Democrats, or do you think that it could be actually doing some harm?
Yeah, I think it could potentially be doing some harm. In the same interview, when he was asked if he has ever apologized to Monica Lewinsky, throughout 20 years of having ample opportunity to do so, he said that he hadn't. So I think, having him out there rehashing a lot of these same things, I think just reminds everyone of what happened 20 years ago and how not great things were and have been for Democrats since then.
Well, and then you throw in Hillary Clinton, who can't get away from a microphone. It's like a magnet. What did she say in one of the recent speeches she gave in the last couple of weeks? I'm not over it.
No kidding.
Which should have been the title of her book, by the way.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that, honestly, it is time to accept the lessons of 2016 on both sides of the aisle, accept that both parties are radically different now than they were 3 years ago. It's not the same political environment of America. I mean, really, it feels like every day we're rehashing the same thing. We're rehashing November 2016 all over again. I think it would be great if people would take the lessons away from that and move along and do what they need to do.
One of the things that I'm curious about, I mean, I know that they did cover "Did you apologize to Monica Lewinsky?" But this president was known to be, or maybe if we were to look at it in the context of how it would be perceived today, his behaviors in the Me Too movement, all of that. We were talking about this earlier. It's astounding that that wasn't brought up during this interview. Why do you think that was?
I think it wasn't brought up because I think that Bill Clinton gets a free pass among a lot of members of the media. I think you're absolutely right that it is time to revisit what happened to Monica. I mean, she was patient zero in all of this, in today's modern media and all these things like that. I definitely think that her story needs to be retold and revisited. Well, I think that the fact that they didn't ask him that and gave him a free pass on that goes to show you that the media definitely has a double standard, and that if the roles were reversed, that things would not at all be the same.
And Bree, I point to the fact that Town & Country invited Monica Lewinsky to this event and then disinvited her once Bill Clinton agreed to show up, and then tried to offer her up little chiclets, if you will, to get her to avoid talking about it. And I think that just shows you why, maybe not a whole party, but that man still gets a free pass from a lot of people.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess in today's environment, even after we've had the Me Too movement, certain victims of sexual abuse are going to get elevated. Their stories are going to get elevated above others. It's really sad that our country is so politically divided to the point that that is a political issue as well, right? And that if you're a victim of a certain man, you're going to get marginalized and pushed to the sidelines. But if you're a victim of another man, it's going to be wall-to-wall coverage of, this same thing, right? That disparity in and of itself is not fair. We shouldn't have a double standard when it comes to women who have, suffered at the hands of powerful men.
Bree, it's Kevin Kelly here, and I think the kind of looming situation about Bill Clinton or Hillary Clinton keep going out to talk about themselves and what happened in November 2016 is overshadowing the Democrats, especially going into this midterm elections. Do you think what the Clintons are doing is counterproductive to helping the Democrats in the elections coming up?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's very clear that the base of the Democratic Party has moved past the Clintons. You know, I think it would behoove the Democratic Party if they would pick up on that cue, you know, and would say, okay, it's very clear that our voters do not like these people. Let's move on and figure out what they do like, who they do want to see on the ticket coming forward, who they do want to see on the TV, and what issues that they actually do care about. It's very clear that Democrats honestly don't care about many of the factions of the people that they try to pretend to care about or say that they care about. And I think this is just another example of that.
So this spy political thriller that President Clinton worked on with James Patterson, it involves cyber espionage and a traitor in the White House. Is this a commentary on the current political environment, according to Clinton? And based on what you said, Bree, about the division in this country?
Yeah, I definitely think it could be a not so subtle, you know, swipe at what's going on. You know, I personally am kind of tired of fictionalized stories that are kind of ripped from the headlines, especially regarding this issue, just because I personally feel just totally saturated, you know, with coverage of this. I don't think that, you know, the things that I enjoy for fiction and for pleasure reading need to have this as well. Personally, that's how I feel about it.
Bree, good to see you. I know
good to see you too.
The outrage machine in the last week has been, and I don't even know how they're getting the gasoline to keep it charged up. But anyway.
Yeah. The perpetual revolution marches on, as always.
Good to see you, Bree Payton.
Good to see
always.
you, too.
So President Trump tweeting this morning, "This is my 500th day in office, and we have accomplished a lot. Many believe more than any president in the first 500 days." That's Kat Timpf. That's not me. Well, listen, he lists what he's accomplished: massive tax and regulation cuts, military and vets, lower crime and illegal immigration, stronger borders, judgeships, best economy and jobs ever, and much more. We had repeal and replace done, and the saving to our country of $1 trillion, except for one person. But it is getting done anyway. Individual mandate is gone and great. Less expensive plans will be announced this month. Drug prices coming down, and right to try.
He didn't bring up the wall, though.
Just the way that he tweets and the way that he speaks always makes me laugh.
You can't help it.
Many people believe.
I know.
But he left the wall out.
He did leave the wall out.
Well,
That's pretty telling.
He did talk about border.
Well, there was no wall funding for the most part. There was replacement fencing funding in the omnibus spending bill. No restrictions on sanctuary cities in that spending bill. So again, but I will quote Ed Rollins. He said that the 2020 bumper sticker should be promises made, promises kept.
Yep.
Because that's a lot of it. Whether you agree with the president or not, he's gotten a lot done.
Certainly has accomplished a lot.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. But look forward on health care. Don't go backwards.
But they've got to come up with a plan.
They have to come up with a plan.
Those premium increases are going to get announced in October.
That's right.
Right before people go to the
So look
polls.
forward and get something done. Don't look back to what happened.
You do not want Nancy Pelosi as the Speaker of the House.
No, certainly not.
So coming up, Dell reporting quarterly earnings before the bell this morning, beating revenue expectations. We'll break down those numbers ahead. Plus, high stakes in the soybean industry. You get a live look with Connell McShane on the farm, the impact of the tariff tussle between the U.S. and China on the farming communities. Next.
Ain't no closing time, ain't no cover charge, just country boys and girls getting down on the farm.
Welcome back. I'm Dagen McDowell in for Maria Bartiromo. It's Monday, June 4th. Your top stories at 8:30 a.m. Eastern. Markets still gaining, a 139-point gain on the Dow futures right now. We're looking at a nice rally to start this new week. This after stocks rallied on Friday after that much better than expected jobs report. Again, to point that out, job growth accelerated last month from where it's been on average in the last 12 months. It's an incredible thing in an economic expansion that's been going on for more than 9 years. Global markets following those gains. Look at England, France, and Germany. We have gains across the board there. And in Asia overnight, it was the same story, buying galore. All four markets, major markets in Asia, up this Monday. Nevertheless, trade turmoil. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross returns from China with no deal, and it comes as our allies ramp up the threat of retaliation over steel and aluminum tariffs. But White House Trade Policy Director Peter Navarro is standing firm on the need for these tariffs.
All the president is doing is defending this country's national security, sovereignty, and economic security from no flood of imports.
We look at the implications for business and markets straight ahead. Targeting the gas tax, a battle looming in California over a 12-cent hike. How it could impact the midterms as voters there head to the polls tomorrow. Amazon in focus, one analyst raising his price target to $2,000 a share. But where does it put the company in the race to $1 trillion against Apple? We'll tell you. Dell rising in the pre-market, the company reporting better than expected revenue. The details later this hour. But targeting tariffs, U.S. allies criticizing the Trump administration over its latest round of tariffs ahead of the G7 summit later this week in Quebec, Canada. Farmers are among the hardest hit because of the tariffs so far. Connell McShane is in Ogden, Iowa, with the very latest details. Hey, Connell.
Hey there, Dagen. Yeah, you know, it's interesting. We wanted to try to make this story come to life as much as we can. You're talking about the trade talks over the weekend. So we come out to this soybean farm in a beautiful part of Iowa. And I was just going to get down here and show you the rows of soybeans that are being grown here. And the idea when you think about trade with China, look at these rows. They won't be ready for harvest until September, is why they're so low to the ground. But 1 out of every 3 rows of soybeans that we're looking at end up going from the United States to China eventually. The business numbers-wise works out to about $12 billion a year. So when we talk about trade tensions in the United States, they're felt out here in Iowa. I want to introduce you to Ron Heck, who's out here with us, a farmer in Iowa, is also on the President's Advisory Council for Agriculture. Ron, thanks so much, first of all, for having us out to your farm. It's a beautiful place.
Thank you. It's a great place to be this morning.
Well, we were in Beijing there about a month ago or so, and at the time they were telling us that some of the orders for later in the year had actually stopped for soybeans coming from the United States. But how has your business been impacted by all this trade talk, trade tensions?
Yeah, well, actually, the price of soybeans has gone up since the talks started. Buyers around the rest of the world are stepping up and buying more soybeans than they were. So far, we've had a price increase.
How does the business work? In other words, this time of year, they're not normally the Chinese buying from the United States, right? Comes later in the year?
Right. China is a seasonal buyer. They buy from the United States about 6 months a year during our harvest time, and then they buy about 6 months a year from South America.
From Brazil and Argentina and what have you. So as a final point, what's your big worry in all of this? Could they shift some of that buying to the Brazilians or the Argentinians, and how do you see the whole thing playing out?
Absolutely. So far, so good. Everything's been fine. But if they would shift their purchases during their normal purchasing time from the U.S., which is starting in September, that could be a problem for us, and that's when we might feel the price impact.
All right, so you'll watch these trade talks like the rest of us. We'll be talking to Ron and some of the folks out here digging throughout the day, but that's the idea. They're watching it like all of us, but watching it obviously a little bit more intently because this is their livelihood, $12 billion a year business.
Connell, do you mind if I'm curious to ask Ron something? Can you is he making any changes in the way he's managing his farm at all? Has he made any? Is he changing?
Well, you know that.
You might already know that.
It's interesting. It's interesting. We've talked a little bit about that off camera, but Dagen was asking if, and just a quick answer, Ron, if you're making any changes in the way you're managing your farm because of this. I know it's tough to anticipate what's next.
No, I'm not really making any changes, but I'm being more watchful of what's going on in the marketing. But no changes are called for yet. Actually, nothing has happened so far, and there is a chance that as a result of these negotiations, it will actually be helpful for U.S. and Chinese soybean trade. So it's hard to know which way to jump right now.
And that's kind of a final point, Dagen, is that the Chinese already charge a tax, right? There's a 16% tariff on soybeans coming out of the United States into China now. Their threat is to make it 25, but people like Ron are hoping, obviously, maybe that number at 16 goes lower. So that's why they're so uncertain. They may come out on top by the time this is all done. But right now, they just don't know.
I said when you were talking, you do such incredible reporting. So I'll say that to your face, McShane. Connell McShane for us in Iowa.
Thank you.
All right, take care. You can catch Connell all day, actually for the next few days in Iowa. Rhetoric over Trump's tariffs heating up over the weekend, with Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau calling the president's move an insult. White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow saying we must put America first.
Mr. Trudeau, I think he's overreacting. I don't want to get in the middle of that. As a fine friend and ally of the United States, nobody denies that. But the point is, we have to protect ourselves. Okay. We must protect ourselves.
You said we need to.
Larry Kudlow also said this is like a family squabble, a feud. Joining me now with more about this tiff over tariffs, Brandywine Global Portfolio Manager Jack McIntyre. Jack, to be clear, Friday today, there is no worry showing up in the stock market here at home.
Yeah, that's correct. Well, because hey, we know the U.S. economy is doing well. It was a strong employment report. Right, the risk obviously is from a trade standpoint, is it going to escalate? I think the markets are kind of keying off of Kudlow and Mnuchin versus Navarro and Lighthouser. And if that's, as long as that's the case, I think the equity market will do okay.
Jack, you know, one of the interesting things, it's Kevin Kelly here, one of the interesting things that's been a theme this year for the markets is the rising rate environment. We've touched 3.15 on the 10-year Treasury on an intraday basis. What are your worries for the fixed income markets, and are they going to be exacerbated given the trade talks, given kind of what's happening right now with our ballooning deficit, with as well as a bunch of other structural things that are going to be happening over the next decade, where we have to issue tons of debt?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. You know, the back end of that, about the budget deficit increasing, trade deficit deteriorating, I mean, ultimately, that should be weaker or drive the U.S. dollar lower, which to me is part of the solution. It would help maybe alleviate some of the trade tension in there. But so I think, see, I'm not that worried from a fixed income investor standpoint. I don't see a lot of inflation pressures building right now. The Fed is going to go slow. I think they've kind of given us the roadmap. So, yeah, yields are going to drift higher, but not to the point where it's going to derail the U.S. economy.
Jack, there's a front page story in the Wall Street Journal today talking about the global economic, the growth story globally is fading. Dimming markets optimism is the headline. The global manufacturing, the index there, 9-month low. Baltic Dry Index, a measure of shipping costs, down 22% since the peak last month. Copper prices also down. Can the U.S. keep growing at a clip that the Atlanta Fed thinks this quarter is going to be 4.8% growth, which is extraordinary? Can we keep growing at that kind of pace if the rest of the world is slowing?
So, yeah, I'm not sure we're going to actually print 4% in the U.S., but so I think if you look at China and the U.S. and combine those are two big, obviously, economies where data is still coming in better than expected. That's why I take the other side of that article, because I think the global economy is still on solid footing. Yeah, Q1 was certainly a little bit slower. I suspect we'll see a little uptick in growth. I don't see a global inventory overhang. The key is on the corporate sector, CapEx. I suspect we'll see a CapEx cycle. Tying in the trade tensions, though, that creates uncertainty in the business community. And if it accelerates, then the corporate sector might not build out CapEx quite to the degree that they would absent those trade tensions. But bottom line, I think the global economy is still on very solid footing.
Well, on that note, there's a survey from the National Association of Business Economics that shows many are worried about a recession by 2020. Your take on that report? Because again, we're not more than 9 years into this expansion. That would be a recession by 2020 would be an expansion of 12 years. But what's your take? Because again, to introduce the worry of tariffs and what that will do to business, prices and business activity here in the U.S.
Right. So I don't think expansions have to die of old age. And the one characteristic of this expansion, as you point out, it's been long, but it's been a pretty slow expansion. So it's not strong, but it's long. But you're right. There's risk on the trade standpoint. Clearly, if this escalates into a trade war, that's going to bring forward the next recession. But if I'm right about CapEx kind of coming to the forefront, and inflation not getting out of hand, because the Fed obviously ends up ending a lot of these expansions. And if inflation remains tame, the Fed won't do it this time around. So it's a possibility. It's 18 months away, but I don't think it has to happen.
Thank you, Jack. Good to see you, Jack McIntyre. The president continues to tweet this morning, writing this: as has been stated by numerous legal scholars, I have the absolute right to pardon myself. But why would I do that when I have done nothing wrong? In the meantime, the never-ending witch hunt led by 13 very angry and conflicted Democrats and others continues into the midterms. And he tweeted this again: Mr. President, are you watching Mornings with Maria? China already charges a tax of 16% on soybeans. Canada has all sorts of trade barriers on our agricultural products. Not acceptable. Because that's exactly what Connell McShane was just talking about with that soybean farmer. So it could go to 25%, at least that's the U.S. threat, but could it go lower than 16%? We'll be right back. The president's still tweeting this morning: the U.S. has made such bad trade deals over so many years that we can only win. Shares of Dell, meantime, up 2% this morning after beating first quarter revenue expectations. Nicole Petallides at the New York Stock Exchange with much more. Nicole.
Good Monday morning, Dagen. That's right. So we're watching Dell to the upside this morning after the revenue really wowed Wall Street. You can see the stock is up about 2%. So they saw the PC shipments on the rise. In fact, products overall saw an increase of 22%, and that is the mother lode of what they do for revenue. About 78% of the revenue comes from products. So that's where they saw the increase of 22%. Services revenue also gained, and so with that, you see it was a winning quarter. The stock over 52 weeks is up about 24%. And then Amazon. When we're watching Amazon, we had some positive comments from SunTrust Robinson Humphrey. The analyst there puts a $2,000 price target. This is the fourth time this year that he's upped his price target. He actually is liking private label for the company. That would include Amazon's Echo Essentials apparel, Elements nutritional supplements. But when will it get to that $1 trillion market cap? Will it beat out Apple to do so? Well, in fact, if you want to see Amazon at $1 trillion market cap, it would have to trade at $2,060.89. So not quite yet, but it's had 5 record closes in a row, looking at a 6th this morning. Back to you.
Thank you, Nicole. Nicole Petallides at the New York Stock Exchange. Google in hot water, and now some are calling for a probe of the tech company in the wake of Google listing Nazism as an ideology of the California Republican Party. Joining me now, the host of Varney and Company, Stuart Varney.
Pretty strong stuff, I'd say, when you're bandying about labels like Nazis, and a North Carolina state senator was called a bigot, and that was stamped across her picture. This is all part of the Google picture at the moment, and I think it's one of the reasons why Google is underperforming the other tech stocks. You may notice, Dagen, that recently Microsoft passed Google in terms of overall market value. That was a surprise. And there's other things going on as well. I mean, remember the 60 Minutes piece 1 week ago where it emerged that Google is watching you, knows everything about you, but who's watching Google? Well, now Representative Devin Nunes says, look, you're operating like a monopoly. Keep going like this, and we're going to have hearings into you. Well, that's interesting, because that's a real threat to Alphabet's business, Google's business, going forward, its profitability going forward. I think they're pressing for the breakup of the company. This is something to watch, because big tech is so powerful, they're just asking the politicians to rein them in.
And they've gotten away with a lot in recent years, and we just sat back and did nothing.
That's true.
Stuart, great to see you.
You too.
Always, my dear sir. 9 a.m. to noon, Monday through Friday, Stuart Varney, Varney & Company. You can't miss a minute. Coming up, a fight over California's 12-cent gas tax intensifies. We head live to Orange County, California, where a midterm battle to repeal the state's gas tax is brewing. A midterm battle over California's 12-cent gas tax is brewing. Hillary Vaughn is live in Orange County, California with the very latest. Hey, Hillary.
Hey, Dagen. Well, national Democrats tell me their pathway to the majority in November runs right here through California. They are targeting 10 seats in the state, 4 right here in Orange County. But national Republicans say this 12-cent gas tax increase at the pump that state Democrats pushed through is actually going to pump the brakes on their road to victory in November because Republicans say it's energizing their base.
There's a lot of energy on the Republican side. People want to talk about how Democrats are enthused. Well, I don't see Democrats marching in the streets over paying upwards of $5 a gallon for gasoline. I think this is going to resonate with voters, not just now, but as well in the fall.
Voters are so fired up over this gas tax issue that one state senator is facing a recall vote tomorrow to kick him out of office for voting for the tax. But the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee is convinced voters aren't going to be worried about rising transportation costs when weighing who to support for Congress and instead are focused on what's happening in D.C.
I think that when voters are going to the polls this week, the issues that they are thinking about when they're voting for Congress are the issues that they're seeing coming out of Washington.
There is one tax Democrats say voters are worried about, the GOP tax plan that they say has hit voters in California the hardest. But California Republican leadership says Democrats in the state are to blame for the high taxes.
I think there's a collective Democrat strategy to blame Washington, D.C. and Donald Trump for all of the ills in California. The fact of the matter is the Democrats own California. They've had total control of it for over 7 years, and they don't want to take credit for their record here.
Dagen, this $52 billion tax plan is meant to push cars off the road, but the GOP hopes it'll push Democrats off the ballot in November. Dagen.
Thank you, Hillary. Hillary Vaughn for us in Orange County, California. Coming up, final thoughts from our All-Stars. We'll be right back. A giant fake hug to Kat Timpf, Kevin Kelly, and Lee Carter for being with me this morning. So much to talk about trade, but these markets are loving what's coming out of Washington, at least so far. That does it for Mornings with Maria. Varney and Company is up right now. Stuart, it is all yours, sir.
All right, we're off, and we are running this Monday morning. Looks like kind of a follow-on from last week. Good morning, everyone.